The Mahdi controlled the countryside. Now he had to rid Sudan of a city that was the epitome of evil. The Mahdi had to take Khartoum. He ordered his forces to close in on the city. When he heard about the Mahdi's successes, the first reaction of British Prime Minister William Gladstone was to wash his hands of the whole affair. He suggested that the Egyptian government leave the country to its own devices. But public opinion demanded that a price be paid for Hicks's death. Someone had to deal with the upstart Mahdi once and for all. In the popular view, who better to pick than a man who had defended Shanghai heroically against a rebellion led by a self-proclaimed messiah? A man who had trained in siege tactics, the experienced Sudan campaigner Charles Gordon. The British Empire's favorite troubleshooter. Gordon fitted perfectly the Victorian heroic ideal of a moral titan taking on and defeating the dark forces that threaten civilization. While the British public was clamoring for its hero to trounce the Islamic fundamentalists, Gordon was indulging his favorite hobby in Jerusalem, mapping the last journey of Christ. Despite the popular acclaim, choosing to send this Christian maverick to Sudan was risky for the government.
Remember, this was a problem that had come to them very, very suddenly, and they were looking for a swift solution. They knew that Gordon was in some ways an unstable and maverick figure, but they also believed him to be influential and effective.
Gladstone eventually succumbed to the moral interventionists, but he dispatched Gordon to Sudan with strict orders to do no more than evacuate foreigners from the city. But on his journey down the Nile from Egypt, the evacuation of Khartoum was the last thing on Gordon's mind.
Gordon's assessment of the Mahdi was, I think, consistently wrong. As soon as he knew about the situation, Gordon seems to have decided that the Mahdi was just one of many figures, religious reformers or revivalists, who sprang up from time to time and who could be suppressed with relatively little effort.
Accompanying Gordon down the Nile was his adjutant and admirer, Colonel James Stewart.
This is a page from Stewart's journal. It describes their journey down to Khartoum, on their way ostensibly to begin the evacuation of the Egyptian garrisons there. And what one sees very clearly from the journal at this point is how Gordon's mind is always racing ahead. It's always formulating some new idea, some new plan. And so, as Stewart records Gordon's word, as soon as the Egyptian troops were withdrawn, they, the Sudanese people, might make application to HM government to give them HM support and to be a protecting power to the Sudan. So, Gordon, having less than 3 weeks before been explicitly instructed that Her Majesty's government had no intention of assuming any responsibility for the Sudan, went on to make a public pronouncement to encourage the people of the Sudan in the belief that Britain would take over the role of protecting power.
Gordon arrived in Khartoum as a savior. The market was festooned with bunting and colored lamps. There was a firework display. After an assessment of the security situation, he reported back to Cairo that Khartoum was as safe as Kensington Park. Gordon then sent the Mahdi words of greeting a red ceremonial robe, and a pasha's fez. He offered to make the Mahdi Sultan of Kordofan if the uprising came to an immediate halt. This was the beginning of a 9-month correspondence.
Gordon announced that this was a technique to discredit the Mahdi and to divide his following. He believed that the Mahdi ultimately would not be able to resist these kind of earthly temptations, and that in succumbing to them, he would lose his reputation. The Mahdi wrote back, declining and saying that he would expect Gordon himself instead to offer allegiance to him as the Mahdi and to join his movement and to become one of his followers. And very famously, he sent Gordon a jibbah, one of the garments worn by the Ansar, the followers of the Mahdi. Gordon's reaction to that gift was, I think it's fair to say, tempestuously angry, that he declined this in the most strident terms and demonstratively threw away the jibbah.
You know, I think Gordon himself did not have any signs of respect to the Mahdi. He has the same or had the same type of ethnocentricity that many Western leaders show towards leaders in my part of the world.
Gordon ignored his orders to evacuate Khartoum and decided instead to smash up the Mahdi. He was to be a hero. But for Gordon, Khartoum was to be no Shanghai. By December of 1884, the city was surrounded by the Mahdi's army. But Gordon still managed to send a telegram to Cairo saying, "Khartoum is all right, could hold out for years." Days later, as the Mahdi's forces continued to close in on the city, the telegraph lines were cut. Despite having Gordon at his mercy, the Mahdi made every attempt to avoid bloodshed. Khalid Idris's grandfather, Abu Gaja, was given charge of the attack on the city by the Mahdi.
He wouldn't attack or make a siege of any place without writing many times to convince the people that we don't want bloodshed. We should avert these calamities and bloodshed. And in that sense, he wrote to General Gordon.
He pleaded with him so much that we will return you to your people with honor, that we don't want to fight you, that we know that you have great respect with your people. So please let's call this encounter off.
But General Gordon was quite, if I may say, stubborn, and he couldn't at all change his mind. He believes that he has a mission and he'll stick to it. Well, he said, in fact, I will not leave this place if that meant my life.
Sir, betrayed by his own government, and abandoned, feel more interest in the safety of General Gordon than in any other.
We feel that every day wasted puts a nail into Gordon's coffin.
Heroism is
This
cherished
would be entirely due to the supineness and neglect of the British government, as an Indian force should be.
Nor can there be a more terrible example of faithlessness on the part of a government than this. The press and public blamed the Prime Minister Gladstone for abandoning their hero Gordon to the barbarians. Against his will, Gladstone finally ordered British forces to leave Cairo and begin the 1,600-mile journey across the unforgiving desert to relieve Khartoum. Against fierce resistance from the Mahdist forces, the relief column made painfully slow progress. When he wasn't dealing with desertions among his troops, Gordon would spend hours on top of the governor's palace, scanning the horizon for the relief force that failed to materialize. In Instead, he saw only thousands of the Mahdist dervish soldiers preparing for battle.
By that stage, it must have been very, very clear to Gordon that things had gone wrong, and that his hope that the British government would send a force to relieve or support him was also at least premature, if not entirely erroneous.
Your situation is hopeless. People have revolted all over the Sudan, so your escape routes are completely shut. The incoming force to relieve you will not be able to relieve you because we have all the access routes completely besieged, and therefore he pleaded so much, let us call this encounter off.
Gordon seemed resigned to his fate. In one of his last letters to his sister Augusta, this Christian hero put his fate in God's hands.
I think that our Lord is ruling all things to the glory of his kingdom, and cannot wish things were different than they are. I have done my best for the honor of our country. Goodbye.
Khartoum had held out for a staggering 317 days, until the night of January the 25th, 1885.
There was a council, Mahdi's Khalifas. They decided that it is right time for invading Khartoum. Al-Mahdi himself crossed the river that night, and he preached his Ansars and conveyed to them, this is the night, this is what we've been waiting for.
During the Mahdi final talk to his people, to the soldiers, to Ansar, the night of the attack on Khartoum, he ordered them or advised them not to kill certain specific number of people. Among them was Gordon himself.
You Europeans don't want to believe this. You think that the Mahdi was a bloodthirsty man. I don't think so. He never liked that. In the case of Gordon, he said he didn't want Gordon to be killed. He wanted him to be with him.
But the polite exchange of letters had stopped. The Mahdi's diplomatic gestures were now replaced by a ruthless military will. In the early hours of the morning, 50,000 of the Mahdi's dervishes swarmed over Khartoum's defenses. They butchered citizens and soldiers, enslaved their captives, and sent girls to harems. Gordon was trapped in his palace and speared to death. Then, his head was cut off and paraded through the streets. Two days later, the relief expedition finally arrived. In Britain, the sacrifice of Gordon sent a convulsion through society.
This was, if you like, a double blow, the death of the man himself, but also the failure of British arms to rescue him. And this was seen very much as a national calamity, and there was an extraordinary outpouring of national grief, not perhaps entirely unprecedented, but certainly on an extraordinary scale. It's very difficult to think of a comparative event within that period of British history.
In Sudan, people prayed in celebration.
تاريخنا بيبدأ بالمهدية لأنه الثورة الكبيرة اللي حققت لنا حريتنا واستقلالنا وخلتنا من الدول اللي أصبحت في تعرضه للاستعمار البريطاني أصبحت على كل لسان مشهورة برا. زمان ما كانت السودان ذكر خامل ما معروف. بداية بالثورة المهدية بدأت الانطلاقة دي وما حتنتهي. وبعدين تعلق الناس لها حسب المهدية بيجي من هنا، من إنه هي دي الثورة اللي حررت البلد لأول مرة.
Although the Mahdi had united the country against foreign rule and defeated the greatest empire the world had ever seen, he didn't live to see his dream of a new Islamic state. Six months after Gordon's head was paraded around the ruins of Khartoum, the Mahdi died of typhus. Under his chosen successor, the Khalifa, the Mahdi's legacy lived on in the establishment of a vast and aggressive Sudanese state, the Mahdiya. But the Khalifa lacked the political skills to hold the country together. And as the years went by, tribal infighting began to destabilize the country.
But it's typical of all revolutions, of course. They are very successful when it comes to defense and resistance and jihad. But then even when you conquer, when you achieve, you don't know how to build. you may be capable of destroying the enemy, but you don't know how to build your own model.
In London, the instability of the fledgling Islamic nation was now seen as a real threat to Egypt, Britain's key strategic interest in the region.
For the British, it was quite clear that there will be no stability in Egypt if Sudan was ruled by and controlled by a hostile nationalist regime. The Mahdist state was an exception, and this could not be tolerated.
To justify a new military operation against the Mahdiya, Sudan was presented to the British public as a human rights disaster in a carefully orchestrated campaign by a man who idolized Gordon. He was another imperial Christian evangelist, Reginald Wingate. Wingate, as head of intelligence for the Egyptian army, made it his business to disparage the Mahdiya as a corrupt and oppressive state. This was a matter of revenge, pure and simple.
Now, there is no doubt whatsoever that all reference to the oppression, the corruption, and so on, is an exaggeration. Wingate did encourage all writers to character assassinate the leaders of the Mahdist state, and also to depict it as corrupt, oppressive, in order to persuade public opinion in Britain to support the campaign to avenge Gordon.
Yet the Mahdiya was not going to self-destruct. It had to be defeated. 13 years were to pass before the British saw their martyr avenged, and they had to go to extraordinary lengths to do it. It took army engineers 2 years to build a railway from Egypt south across the Sahara Desert to Khartoum. 2,000 miles of track laid at 3 miles a day for the sole purpose of transporting an army of 20,000 soldiers to eliminate an enemy of the empire. This force was led by the ideal Christian warrior, a ruthless military technician and deeply devout man. Like Wingate, General Herbert Horatio Kitchener was one of Gordon's most avid admirers. When he found out that the invasion of Sudan had been ordered by the British government, Kitchener danced with joy. Now, Kitchener and Wingate had the chance to avenge their hero and teach the dervishes an unforgettable lesson. What happened here at Omdurman in 1898 was the zenith of Victorian imperialism. The last hurrah of the generation that regarded world domination as its manifest destiny. The Battle of Omdurman was to pit the full military might of the biggest empire the world had seen against an army of desert tribesmen. This map shows where two worlds clashed. On one side, 50,000 desert-dwelling Islamic fundamentalists spread out across the plain of Kerari. On the other, 20,000 well-drilled British and Egyptian soldiers with their backs to the Nile. Standing in the British lines was the young Winston Churchill, a Harrow-educated army officer who had wangled his way into the force as a war correspondent for the Morning Post. What he saw astonished him.
The dervishes were now 2 miles distant, their line being, I estimated, 4 to 5 miles long and hundreds deep. It seemed to envelop our force altogether, and was truly an amazing sight. They were chanting ceaselessly, La ilaha illa wa Muhammad Rasul Allah. There is one God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God.
For Churchill, who rode fearlessly with the 21st Lancers into the dervish lines, this was the most thrilling adventure imaginable.
The event seemed to pass in absolute silence. The yells of the enemy, the clashing of sword and spear, were unnoticed by the senses.
The picture lasted only a moment, but the memory remains forever.
The hungry and attentive Maxims opened fire on them, sweeping them all to the ground. Some in death, others in terror.
Kitchener called a halt to the massacre by saying, "Ceasefire, ceasefire, please. What a dreadful waste of ammunition." The Mahdist revolution had been blown apart by the discipline and firepower of a superior army. "11,000 dervishes died that day, and only 48 British and Egyptian soldiers. With the British and Egyptians now directly installed as Sudan's joint colonial rulers, that, finally, should have been the end of the Mahdi and his Sudanese jihad.
I was in the base of the building when this
happened. Describe what you saw. You saw the second plane.
Looked like a deliberate act.
A deliberate action.
We were all just watching it burn and people were jumping out of it. It was horrible.
The terror tactics of Al-Qaeda are the defining images of the early 21st century. A global network of dedicated militants striking fear into the heart of the West. The foundation for this organization was constructed in Sudan. Throughout British colonial rule in the 20th century, the Mahdi had remained a potent symbol of Sudanese resistance to foreign influence. Then, after 35 years of failed self-government, in 1985, Hassan al-Turabi, Sudan's spiritual leader, formulated a purist Islamic state which echoed the Mahdis. In 1991, he warmly welcomed Osama bin Laden into the country, fresh from his triumph against the Soviet army in Afghanistan.
Anyone who fights the Russians to you is a resistant mujahid. But once the Russians have gone, he himself retroactively becomes a terrorist. He is not a terrorist at all.
Remarkably similar in appearance to the Mahdi, Osama bin Laden came ostensibly as a rich Saudi businessman to invest in the Sudanese economy and to help develop some of the poorest areas. He bought over 1 million acres of agricultural land, established food processing plants, and a complex network of trading companies. One of his construction businesses built a highway 1,200 kilometers across the desert, from Khartoum to the Red Sea. It was also in Sudan that bin Laden set up camps in which hundreds of his followers could be trained in paramilitary tactics. It was from here that fighters were sent to Chechnya and Bosnia, and where attacks on targets in Saudi Arabia and the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were planned. Bin Laden internationalized his terror network in Sudan. This was the start of Al-Qaeda.
The fire does not touch me, covered in dust and the cause of Allah.
Despite the differences between Mahdism and Al-Qaeda, they represent attempts to deal with the same perceived problem, the weakness of Islam in the face of a dominant and corrupting foreign influence.
Muslims can look at what they perceive to be the control, the influence, the political and economic power of Europe and say, this is something that's been done to us. Our position has been undermined deliberately, and we must act against this. And the way that we can remedy our situation is to revive and renew our religion. And that should be the basis of a new Islamic culture.
The resentment of the involvement of the foreigners in the Islamic world is really very great, very strong. And that's why people who are living in misery, in dictatorial regimes, in poverty, they think they can do something similar to what happened before in Islam.
In bin Laden's case, there has been no Kitchener. In 1996, he was exiled from Sudan to Afghanistan at America's request. The Mahdi's memory continues to inspire a new generation. The appeal of his message reflecting the collective pride he touched among some Sudanese.
فكرة المهدية حتظل متقدة طوال جذوتها في صدور الناس، ما أظنها تنتهي بسهولة. لا زال الناس في أجيالنا الموجودة وبيجوا بعدنا عندهم ولاء للمهدية، لأنه ما عندنا تاريخ نتونس به ولا نتكلم ولا نتباهى به ولا نتفاخر به في وطننا ده.
I think that he has given to the Muslim people a sense of the power of people's power, that states and empires and so on are meaningless when confronted with the mobilization of a determined people.